BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNid88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And welcome to BBOR, the home of true crime talk radio and your premier destination for unsolved mysteries, criminal psychology, and exploring the dark side of cyberspace. My name is Ned DeHaan, and I am your host, as well as the creator of AstroPsych 400 here on YouTube, and regular contributor to the Zodiac Killer channel. And a great way to support these shows is just by listening to some more content. But you can also go over to Amazon.com and have a look at the book Killer on a White Horse, written by me, Ned DeHaan. It is a novel, murder mystery, inspired by the Zodiac Manson connection, but it is indeed fictional. However, who doesn't love a good mystery? And there is always the Teespring page. Feel free to check out some of the merchandise. And remember, being weird is not a crime. Let the show begin. Okay, hello everybody. Today is Wednesday, and on Wednesdays this year, I've been doing a regular segment about the Phantom Killer, an unidentified serial killer mystery that took place in 1946. And in addition to that, I would also like to share some announcements and reminders with you guys. The first is that, of course, every Monday is Zodiac Monday, talking about the Zodiac Killer. And on the weekends, I launched a new segment about the death of JonBenet Ramsey back in 1996. And I started by following the book Presumed Guilty by Stephen Singular. But last week, I did an episode on the Tubi original documentary, JonBenet Ramsey's Suburban Nightmare, so there'll be some different sources that will be incorporated into that, and I'm expecting that there will be more than one book discussion for the weekend show. So if you would like to follow along with all of these true crime discussions, you can hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It's a great way to support Black Box Online Radio, but I'm sure if you've made it to this far off corner of YouTube, you're rather curious about true crime cases yourself, so please feel free to drop your ideas in the comments section down below. I also did several episodes recently about Jack the Ripper, so there are a lot of different cases to explore. But this is a multi-part series that I've been doing on Wednesdays about the Phantom Killer, and I started by just doing a basic book discussion on The Phantom Killer by James Presley, and I was talking about the crimes in order. The Phantom Killer only murdered 5 people in 1946. It's a very small crime spree that took place from February 22nd to May 3rd of that year. And this is a book discussion that I've been doing on The Phantom Killer by James Presley, as opposed to a traditional book review. And I don't do book reviews for that very reason. I don't like to follow any type of traditional format. I'm just reading the book, and I find some ideas in it that I get curious about, and I want to talk about, as well as comparing and contrasting the ideas from one true crime writer to the next. But the Phantom Killer first began by attacking Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean LeRae on February 22nd of 1946. Jimmy Hollis was driving and Mary Jean LeRae was in the passenger seat, and by his own admission, he decided to just pull over on the side of the road on a whim, more or less, because he wanted to look at the stars in the night sky, and they were blinded by the lights of someone else's car, and then they were attacked by a masked perpetrator. Somebody was wearing a mask that has holes cut out for the eyes. It's been described as either a white sack or a white pillowcase, and this became the birth of the Phantom Killer. The next attack took place on March 24th of 1946 with the murders of Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore, and their bodies were possibly staged inside of the car that they had been driving. They were shot with a .32 caliber automatic pistol, quite different than the attack on Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean LeRae, because both of those victims survived. They were attacked, beaten. Mary Jean LeRae was sexually assaulted, but neither one of them was murdered. So then there's this double homicide that took place, and about 3 weeks later, the Phantom Killer would attack Betty Jo Booker and Paul Martin. That was the most recent case that I had been discussing in the Phantom Killer saga. And About 2 weeks after that, there is the attack on Virgil Starks as well as his wife Katie Starks. Virgil Starks would have been murdered, but Katie Starks would survive. And I've done episodes on the first three Phantom Killer attacks in this series, the Phantom Killer Saga. Parts 2, 3, and 4 go through the crimes in order, and I will do a bigger episode on the murder of Virgil Starks because I think that that is one of the most telling crimes in the entire mystery in terms of information that we can actually learn about the Phantom Killer. But with the attacks on Griffin and Moore and Booker and Martin, all of the victims passed away, so very little information is able to have been shared. But there was a particular chapter in the book The Phantom Killer by James Presley that stood out to me, and it was chapter 14 that's called Behind a Serial Killer's Facade. I talk about this stuff a lot on BlackBoxOnlineRadio about how does the serial killer think, and a lot of it requires some type of interpretation or even guesswork on my part, or looking at different sources and noting commonalities among them. But I would like to share with you guys some things, and this is page 139 in the book. If serial killers gloat over their misdeeds, they almost never do so publicly, and rarely to other individuals. Doing so would betray them. To risk exposure would court severe punishment, although they may be proud of what they have done, frustrating the police, terrifying the public at large, and revealing their crimes that are so monstrous they will go to any length to think about them, but not share them to thwart detection. And I had so many initial responses to that. Firstly, this whole thing about if serial killers gloat over their misdeeds, they almost never do so publicly. Well, there are so many exceptions to that rule that that's not even a rule itself. What about the Zodiac Killer? What about Jack the Ripper? And way beyond those two serial killers who wrote letters to the press. I mean, there's also David Berkowitz, the son of Sam Shooter, and BTK, and even Maury Travis, the serial killer operating in the St. Louis area, who sent in a map to the police that had information involving an internet address, and they were able to extract that information and then learn his whereabouts. This happens a lot more frequently than we think. I just believe, and again, this is a belief, that we don't know all of the instances of serial killers taunting the police and the press or gloating about their misdeeds publicly. For example, I mean, Kenneth Harrison, the serial killer known as the Giggler, sometimes called the Boston Giggler, also phoned in after one of his murders and saying that there's a body down in the water and he was responsible for it, and said his name was the Giggler and started laughing maniacally. I have an episode about him, and I've talked about him several times on the channel because of how just another crime that took place in the 1960s, some comparing and contrasting among other criminals from the 60s and 70s. But those are just examples off the top of my head of serial killers who chose to gloat over their misdeeds in a public way. And it was the documentary Sons of Sam on Netflix that truly said this. It creates a three-way relationship among the police, the media, and the killer himself. And that some serial killers really have a desire for this. But back to the book here. On rare occasions when a serial killer does talk of his exploits, most but not all serial killers are male, some of the mystery recedes. Those moments have been infrequent but revealing. I also want to point out that I think there are a lot more female serial killers out there than people actually think. It's just a lot of them choose to operate in ways that are, firstly, not as easily detectable, and then secondly, in ways that aren't glorified or shared or even mentioned in the media, particularly with cases of poisonings. And when you read up on female serial killers, you'll find that a lot of them aren't tying up their victims and torturing them. Sometimes, yes, but you will find that there are lots of stories of women who are poisoning multiple people over a period of time, and that meets the definition of being a serial killer. There's a cooling off period in between the murders. So I just wanted to share a little bit of guesswork on my part. I think that is what's happening, and it appears from what we've learned about serial killers, it is, but of course, we have to always keep an open mind to new and oncoming evidence. In this part of the book, though, James Presley does a compare and contrast between the serial killer Alexander Pichushkin and the Phantom Killer. And he talks about how Alexander Pichushkin had this plan to murder 64 people in Moscow, Russia, and he was using that number because of the spaces on the chessboard, and after every murder he would place an object there. And Alexander Pichushkin's claim was that he murdered 61 people, but he was only convicted for 48 of the murders, so says this book here. For some reason, the number 47 stood out to me, but I mean, we'll go with his number. It's been quite a while since I did my episode on Alexander Pichushkin. But he also talks about how Pichushkin would lure his victims to a place called Bitsa Park in Russia, and in addition to being known as the chessboard killer, he's also referred to as the Bitsa Park maniac. And he would use this location because it was a familiar territory, and James Presley even calls it a comfort zone. And almost certainly, if we're going to look at the activities of the Phantom Killer, then the Phantom Killer's comfort zone area would have been Spring Lake Park in the Texarkana area around the Texas-Arkansas border, because that seems to be one of the only locations that actually has any particular commonality among the Phantom Killer's crimes. And I didn't like the word or the term comfort zone immediately, because I also thought that it's a little bit more about practicality rather than comfort. And whether it's Alexander Pichushkin or the Phantom Killer, familiarity with the territory, that would be one thing. And when I think of comfort, I think more about security and feeling of ease. But also, I mean, practicality is so much more important when someone's trying to commit these crimes and get away with it, because, as Presley even states at the beginning of the chapter, if their actions are interrupted, then they can't act out these types of behaviors. And why would they want to continue to do that? Well, here's a quote from Pichushkin in the book on page 140 that says, "For me, a life without murder is like a life without food for you. I felt like the father of all these people, since it was I who opened the door for them to another world." And I don't think that that language is too far out from a lot of the serial killers in the world. A lot of the serial killers say things like that. But read this again, or listen to this again. "For me, a life without murder is like a life without food." The Phantom Killer certainly isn't somebody who is operating like that. Absolutely not. The Phantom Killer committed 5 murders within a very short time frame. And this is obviously someone who can go through longer periods of time without acting. Because as I said, firstly, the first 2 victims, Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean LeRae, were not murdered. And then there's an entire month plus 2 days to the next crime, the attack on Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore. And those victims were murdered. But again, it doesn't seem like someone who is fighting a particular type of urge, or that someone just has this desire to kill, because why the infrequency of crimes, and why such a short crime spree? Although I'm fully aware this is an unsolved case, and the killer could have continued to operate outside of this exact time frame. The killer could have also operated in different parts of the country, and maybe that's as simple as it is that the Phantom Killer moved to a different state and continued committing his crimes. But that is pure speculation at best. Looking at the crimes that have actually been attributed to the Phantom Killer, this seems like somebody who is operating from a place of either perverted calculation or something similar, as opposed to actually just following his urges. It doesn't seem to be urge-based. There's an element of methodical nature to the Phantom Killer. And here's something else, though, that James Presley says in this same chapter. His name, the Phantom, was on everyone's lips in 1946. The policemen sought him futilely. He had committed perfect crimes, attesting to his skills and brilliance. He had outsmarted the smartest. He was almost godlike. In 1946, he must have felt what Pichushkin did thousands of miles away and 60 years later. Did the Phantom Killer also feel like a god as he shot his innocent victims? Probably. He demonstrated power, he made headlines, and an entire community feared him. He was known by his moniker nationwide and abroad. So, I think that that also requires a little bit of unfair speculation on the part of James Presley, because even though I like to say what I think happened, I always have to provide the condition that there are other possibilities. And how do we really know what the Phantom Killer was thinking? Like, did he actually feel like a god? I'm going to provide to you an alternative possibility to that. That this is someone who is very deranged, but still in control of his abilities, and perhaps it could be something more similar to the depictions of the New Orleans Axeman, where it's about committing the crimes as opposed to actually getting his name in the press. And what's the evidence to support that? The Phantom Killer isn't writing letters taking credit for this, calling himself the Phantom Killer, telling the stories of how he committed these murders. This seems like somebody who's getting off on the crimes, who enjoys them, or is at the very least experiencing a large amount of stimulation when he is committing the crimes. And on the Zodiac episode last Monday, I was talking about the show Dexter, about a fictional serial killer, and also the books by Jeff Lindsay, which I had a good time reading. I mean, very entertaining writer. But there's even a discussion in one of the seasons between the fictional Dexter, played by Michael C. Hall, and another fictional serial killer, and that fictional killer says, "I never enjoyed what I did." And I think that that is so telling. I know it's fictional, but I think that it's very revealing about human life and behavior, where some people recreate the cycle of destructive behaviors and they do not enjoy it. So I would propose that as a strong alternative. And I'm not saying that I actually know what the Phantom Killer was thinking. That's how I introduced that segment. I don't know what the Phantom Killer was thinking, and neither does James Presley. And more importantly, there are other reasonable possibilities. And to be fair to this guy, he did say probably. He doesn't know 100%, and he was very clear about that. But we're discussing these things for a reason. And just because it seems like this person is just having a blast murdering these people, he might have actually been experiencing a lot of anger and frustration, and then just continuing the destructive tendencies to pour out and not actually enjoying the crimes that much at all. Many things are possible, but there are some other types of descriptions that are used in here when they talk about, or James Presley talks about the FBI profiler John Douglas, someone who comes up very frequently in true crime discussions. And he says, Douglas and others categorize the killers by how they behave at the crime scene, whether they are organized, disorganized, or a mixture of the two types. The organized offender takes measures to protect himself from suspicion and arrest. He is careful. He often moves the body from the death scene, postponing its discovery. The disorganized offender, on the other hand, may become impulsive under stress and leave the murder weapon or other evidence at the scene. He is, in a word, sloppy. The mixed offender exhibits characteristics of both types and blending organized and disorganized behavior. Now, which one is the Phantom Killer? I mean, James Presley and I are in complete agreement on this. The Phantom Killer is a mixed offender, and sometimes the bodies have been moved, other times they have not been. Sometimes the Phantom Killer has gone through great lengths to track down a victim and make sure they're dead. Other times the Phantom Killer was interrupted doing so, and as I said in the first crime, the victims weren't even murdered. The Phantom Killer is a mixed offender when it comes to organized versus disorganized. Some examples of organized behavior in this chapter that James Presley cites, and I do agree with, is after the murders of Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore, their bodies were moved into the car, and Richard Griffin's pockets were turned inside out. And some people think that it was a genuine robbery, and I even said that that seems like somewhat of a reasonable possibility in this saga when I was doing that particular episode. But I think that one point of contention that I do have with James Presley in this chapter is he says that the reason why the Phantom Killer chose to do that was because he wanted to delay people finding the crime scene. And I think that, again, is almost an unfair speculation, because there are other possibilities. How many times have you heard on this channel when I've been talking about how serial killers can also operate to try and recreate a scene from a particular piece of literature or film or a story, and they're acting out some type of delusional, twisted fantasy, or they were just inspired by someone else's fictitious work of art or work of art period to do something very dark and sinister in real life. So the reason why he did that could have had some type of personal significance to him, and it doesn't even have to be an influence from movies or books. It could also have some type of personal significance to his childhood, and it could have been acting out a revenge fantasy of some sort about why the victims were moved into the car and his pockets were turned inside out. And the whole point is, I don't think that we should narrow down the possibilities as to why this person did something purely because it's the one that just makes sense at the time. Inspector Mark Rowley, who was following the Madeleine McCann case, said very clearly, one thing that we should not do as people who are trying to solve a mystery is try to ask ourselves what the killer was thinking, because or why was the killer choosing to do these things the exact way? Because the majority of people who are listening to this episode, and I will even throw myself into this, are not deranged homicidal maniacs or deranged kidnapping maniacs in the case of Madeleine McCann. Instead, you're having a sane person trying to think like an insane person, and we're not always on the same wavelengths. Although, I know it sounds weird, but I think at times I get pretty close to understanding some of what serial killers think if we accept their words at face value. I mean, Alexander Pichushkin just wrote it out right here. It's like he feels godlike and has this hunger for killing. And I mean, if he did murder 61 people, so he says, there's a very high chance that those things are true, that he did feel godlike when he was committing the murders, and that he was murdering people because he had some type of urge that he was trying to satiate. So I am a little bit divided on James Presley's presentation, but the interesting thing about that is he would also be a little bit divided about mine because we don't see eye to eye. And I think that we don't have to, because until we get definitive answers about who committed these murders, there are going to be different interpretations of the evidence, and there are going to be different interpretations of criminal behavior. And I simply wanted to propose other possibilities to what has been put forward in this chapter here about the Phantom Killer. But one person that does come up again with the Phantom Killer mystery is Dr. Anthony LaPalla, who made a profile of how the Phantom Killer could be thinking and operating. And also, he more or less said that these 5 murders are completely consistent with a single perpetrator, because you have somebody who is first attacking people while wearing a hooded mask and the victims are left alive. And I do repeat that, left alive. The Phantom Killer could have easily killed them, but he didn't. Then you have 2 double murders. And then the killer deviates from the pattern of targeting couples at lovers' lanes to attacking a couple inside a house. Firstly, the victims are both male and female. The only thing that is different is the location, that they're not at a car, but inside a farmhouse. And that is just simply because everybody was expecting the Phantom Killer to attack people in a car near Spring Lake Park to some extent. So to avoid getting caught, this person who is perverted in his own calculations, so says me, went on to attack Virgil Starks and Katie Starks, changing the way he committed crimes to avoid getting caught. This is one person, no multiple killers theory, no mass hysteria, a single person. What's the evidence for multiple killers and mass hysteria? Number one, the crimes were committed in a completely different way. There was one beating, there were two double murders, and again, a man was shot inside his farmhouse, and the victim successfully escaped from that one. Virgil Starks' wife, Katie Starks. The Starks murder was on May 3rd of 1946, and then the activities all just cease after that, and there's no solid explanation as to why that happened. So you also have the media taking the story and running wild, and is it not possible that certain assumptions were made that it has to be the person in this white hooded mask who was committing all of the murders? I mean, was there not just a cluster of murderous activity in Texarkana at the time? And because there was this boogeyman who made one deranged beating of Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean LeRae, everybody just decided to put the blame on him? I'm sure the authorities know whether or not that is true, and they probably had forensic evidence at the time that would have provided an answer one way or the other. But I'm always fascinated with that question. Do you think there were multiple killers in the Phantom Killer mystery, or do you agree with Dr. Anthony LaPalla that this was one person who simply changed the way he committed crimes because he wanted to avoid getting caught? And let's be clear, there's a fair degree of defendability, if that is a word. It's a rather defendable claim that James Presley made about how the Phantom Killer was probably in some godlike state. I just wanted to say there are other possibilities that I think also make sense. But if some way, somehow, we do learn who the Phantom Killer was back in 1946, we find some type of journal and confession that has first-hand evidence with like DNA and some way of connecting this person to the crime scenes and the victims, I will accept the result and I will say, all right, this person says very clearly this is what he was thinking when he committed the crimes. 90% I'll accept it. The other 10% I'll just say he was some type of sexually frustrated jerk who didn't know how to talk to girls. But what do you think about the Phantom Killer mystery? And I know that this episode was all over the map and all over the story, but the chapter focused on how do serial killers think, and I wanted to try and give my own responses on that. And I want to read your responses in the comment section down below, so please contribute to the discussions. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box. And there was always BlackBoxNed88 over on Instagram. And I will see you there for the bonus podcast. Until next time.